How's it going? Welcome back to another Guards of Atlantis painting video. In this video I'll be painting Hanu the Trickster, a fun support hero from the Renowned Hero Pack. Once again, sorry for how long it's been. Around the end of 2024, I was just super busy with work, the holidays, and then also getting sick with COVID, but I'm hoping to get some videos churned out at a good pace now. My Guards of Atlantis Kickstarter packages also arrived at my door yesterday already, so I really want to get some of these Guards of Atlantis minis painted. With that, I'll just move on to the actual painting. I'm starting out by pointing out the mold lines on the mini, but as always, you don't have to bother removing them if you don't want to. But generally, it seems like a sort of standard two-dimensional mold line runs around the entirety of the mini. Up this cloth thing and going up the left arm, with an additional one running along the mask on the side of the face. The mold line continues running up the leg and around the front of the basket, and then all the way down the leg and the arm on the other side of the mini. There's also a mold line on the top of the tail, but you'll be able to tell that I totally forgot to remove that one. But, oh well, it doesn't really matter. I primed the mini the same way that I have all my other Guards minis. I started with a gray primer, airbrushed it with a very light gray from above, and then dry brushed the whole mini with a pure white. As always, the airbrush helps, but it genuinely doesn't make that much difference to just using a rattle can, doing a heavy dry brush of light gray, or just not worrying about that part at all, honestly. So with the model ready to paint, I started blocking in colors. There's a lot going on in this mini, and since he's upside down, it's also a little hard to figure out what's going on and what should be what color, so I wanted to just start by getting a sense of what everything will look like. I started by doing a very rough wet blend on the brown cloth. My darker color is this pure dark golden brown, and the lighter color is a mix of that and pale yellow. Both of these I thinned with a good amount of glaze medium to let that zenithal undercoat show through a bit. This glaze medium also makes the paint dry a bit slower, so it's easier to wet blend the colors together. Incidentally, more just to paint fast and loose than for any other reason, for this mini I'm not using any speed paints or washes, and I'm using a pretty limited selection of paints. I'm also making a pretty heavy use of some glaze medium, thinning my paints down so that the zenithal undercoat shows through a bit. I also used this as an opportunity to test out Pro Acryl's glaze and wash medium, which I just got recently, to see how I like using it. I'm also doing the same thing on the jade surfaces, like the pants and all of these textured cloth type things, just putting the brighter jade color on the raised areas and the dark jade color in places like the underside of the pants. And if you're worried that my wet blending is a super advanced and difficult technique here, please don't worry about that. I'm genuinely just mashing colors onto the mini, not trying to be super precise or work the transition a lot, just kind of putting dark colors in the areas I think should be more in shadow, and brighter colors in the raised areas and edges. If any of the transitions look particularly rough, just drag your brush back and forth across them a few times, but it really doesn't matter too much, it's kind of just getting the initial colors on the mini. Also, I really like this model's upside down pose. It does look fairly dynamic, but the downside is that does mean that when I'm painting him, I have to fairly frequently flip him around to get a better angle on painting all of those bits. In the artwork, Hanu also has a sort of dark jade-colored fur, but I want it to look distinctly different from the jade pants and mask to keep the different parts of the mini nice and readable from a distance. To do that, I mixed plenty of black and bright ivory into the dark jade color, making the colors much more desaturated. And again, I made a lighter color and a darker color of this, and roughly placed the lighter color on the raised surfaces and the darker color on the downwards facing parts. I found I had to go pretty dark with these colors, and they do still look a little close in color to the other jade color, but I can adjust that in the future. Next is the skin, which I tackle in a fairly similar way to back when I painted Wuck. I base coated it with a couple thin layers of a fairly dark desaturated red mix I made, and then that should be a good start for the moment. I didn't bother doing any wet blending here, just regular old base coats. In this case where I'm doing basic layering, I'm not really bothering to thin it down with that glaze and wash medium, I'm just kind of thinning the paint with a few drops of water. And then likewise, all of the rocks just get a fairly thin application of a medium gray. And at this point, since I'm working with smaller bits on the model, I don't feel like any of the rest of this is worth wet blending either, so I just mix up a dark reddish-black color with some glaze medium, and use that to base coat all the ropes and sashes and the accent bits that I want to be red. This part can get a bit fiddly, especially since I decided to paint all the ribbons on his arm cloth thing red too, but that can all be cleaned up later. For these ribbons, I am fairly messy with it, and I also do sort of like a half dry brush overbrush type thing, just only trying to catch the raised edges. I figured this was also a good point to make a few small fixes, doing things like painting red on parts of the mask, painting his hair ponytail things, and fixing a couple of other small bits. I still couldn't really tell what's going on with the mask, but I just kind of guessed at that it should have alternating red and teal colors on it. And just to get colors on everything, I roughly wet blended a dark brown into the center of the base, and a khaki color around the edges. If the paint is thinned with some water or medium, you can keep quite a bit of it on your brush, and it's reasonably easy to just mash those colors together and get a good blend. I did notice though that I actually used a new Vallejo model color khaki, and then when I wet blended with it, it made a ton of little bubbles all over the base. It's not the first time that I've noticed that their updated new line of model color paints tends to do that, so I'll probably avoid wet blending with them in the future. Anyway, now that there's color on everything, I just want to do a few steps before we get to our first stopping point. I mix up a wash using my dark golden brown color, some water, and plenty of glaze and wash medium. I think the ratio was around 1 drop of paint, 6-ish drops of medium, and 3 or 4 drops of water, but it doesn't really matter. Then I just apply this all over the tan cloth, the basket, and also all over his shiny, pearly white teeth to darken them down a little bit. Then I do the same thing with a mix of dark jade and black, making a sort of thick wash out of it. I apply that all over the jade bits, and then also all over the red cloth as well to shade it with a nice dark blue color. This does darken the red down a ton, it looks really dark now, but I actually want the red to be very dark so that we can make those strong red highlights really stand out later. When you bring your highlights for red too bright, it starts to turn very pink very fast, so by keeping the shadows really dark, I can still have a big highlight jump up to a nice vibrant red, but not have it shift into the pink range. I also almost forgot to mention, I use this jade and black mix wash also on all of the fur, just kind of trying to darken it down more and make it look more different from the jade cloth. And while I have this cool black wash mixed up, I also take a bit of it, mix some brown into it, and apply that all over the base to shade that too. And at this point, I've used the Pro Acryl Glaze and Wash medium for both glazing and washing now. And honestly, so far, it seems pretty good. I know I'm a bit of a Pro Acryl fanboy, but honestly it works pretty well, and I like that the consistency is just a little bit thicker than a lot of other mediums. The mini's starting to look nice and muddy and drab now, so let's do a couple quick steps to fix that. The first main offender is the skin. All I do here is 2 simple highlight layers. First I use this shadow flesh color, and then the second highlight layer will be mixing a bit of tan flesh into it for a second highlight. This is nothing fancy, I just thinned the paint down a little bit and basically just painted the raised edges with it. When I did my second highlight, I just kept it a little bit more constrained, only painting it on the parts that I want to be the very brightest. I'm not really worrying too much about exact highlight placements either. I just kind of put highlights on the raised areas and the things like the knuckles and the ends of the fingertips and toe tips, whatever you call it, but your highlight placement really doesn't have to be too exact or too perfect at all. That's already looking a ton better now in my opinion, and now just one more extra bit. I do 2 simple highlights on all the red cloth, with my first one being a bit of black mixed into this bold red color, and thinned down with some glaze medium. This first highlight is a sort of deep, rich red color, and I painted over all the raised edges, just leaving the dark color in the recesses. At this point, I'm already feeling like this model is really coming together in a big way. I just really like how this bright red and the bright jade look together. Obviously, there's no reason that you have to paint it the exact way as I do with this strong red and the deep shadows in the red and all that sort of stuff, But I just really like this punchy, high contrast result with these really deep shadows on the vibrant colors. This already helps a ton, but then I do a second highlight of pure red, and now this cloth really pops. These two highlight steps also make the red and the skin look very different from one another, and the strong red is a really nice complement to the jade colors, in my opinion. And now you can see that I'm also making sure to paint the red parts of this mask with this strong red, just to really make sure that this mask face doesn't look too similar to the actual real skin face that's right next to it. Then I do a quick dry brush of a highlight color on the base, and I paint the base rim black, and I think that's a pretty good first stopping point. I did realize at this point though that the base is meant to be a bunch of fallen leaves, so in the extra steps I'll probably go back and fix that. But as it is, I think the model right now is in a really good place. The red and the jade really pop on the table, and everything else just, it looks totally fine enough that if you're looking at it from 2 or 3 feet away, you won't notice any issues with it. But if you do want to continue on and really push it to that next level, take it from that sort of tabletop standard to that really nice high tabletop standard, I really encourage you to follow along with, as many of these next steps as you want to do. Obviously, you can do however many of them you want or skip however many of them you want. Doesn't really matter. Anyway, we're continuing on with more highlights, roughly in order of what I think is most important and stands out the most as needing work. So, starting with the cloth, I do 2 highlight passes. First is just a mix of khaki and pale yellow, and then just a pure pale yellow as the final highlight. Both of these I thin down with some of that glaze and wash medium, kind of the theme of this video, as most of the things are thinned down with it. But that just keeps the paint thinned a little bit more and keeps the highlights from being too super stark. This is also totally random and unrelated, but I've also included a bunch of footage of me kind of swiping the paint colors on my thumb sometimes. I'm just doing that to show all of you the consistency that I keep the paint at. I kind of use my thumbnail as a sort of staging ground for testing the consistency of my paints. Then I do the same thing with the jade, just 2 simple passes of highlights, and I really try and push the vibrancy and value of this. The first highlight, I do a mix of jade and bright ivory, and then the second one I do the same and just add more bright ivory. Again, specifically with the jade, I'm trying to push these highlights really bright, since I want the jade and all of the red accent bits to be sort of like the 2 big standout parts of this mini. Then I move on to mixing a desaturated bluish gray highlight and dry brush that on the fur. And then I came back with a brush to pick out some highlights on the hair on the face that didn't quite get hit enough by the dry brush, if that makes sense. Then I move on to the rocks. I just do a couple of really scratchy highlights to imply a rough texture. And then my final highlight is more focused on catching only the raised edges of these rocks. At this point, I think pretty much all of the highlights on the surfaces are looking pretty good, so I moved on to painting the eyes with my usual method. They're a little bit tricky to reach with a brush, but luckily I didn't need to do too much cleanup, and the cleanup is pretty easy since that skin around the eyes is that really dark desaturated reddish color. Now I also decided to do some fun little extras. I decided to paint one of the rocks in the basket as a sort of green gemstone, just using a filter of green paint over it, shading that with a darker green, and then painting in a couple of very strong highlights. I just kind of did this quick, maybe took 2 minutes or less on the whole thing. Honestly, not even really waiting for the paint to dry before moving on to the highlights, but it worked fine. Then I fixed up the base by painting the leaves a dark green, thinned down with a bit of medium and water. I did a little bit of really rough feathering with a damp brush here, but honestly it really does not matter much. Then once that was dry, I dry brushed them all green, and that's pretty much it. When I started painting Hanu, I couldn't really clearly envision how it would turn out, but I think it helped that I painted Wuk in similar colors a while back. Surprisingly, using just a fairly small selection of acrylics and some glaze and wash medium, also worked pretty smoothly. I didn't really constrain myself on purpose, I just didn't really feel the need to reach for lots of different colors and washes and speed paints. Anyway, I'll still have a variety of videos coming out, but for Guards of Atlantis, next I'll paint Min, and then I think I'll try to tackle a whole hero pack per video going forward. That's it for now. Take care of yourself, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.